Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Nice to see you all. That's Houdini. That's a classic rap song from my childhood. And that's our theme today. We're gonna think about whether or not it makes sense to speak of Abraham as having friends. Did Abraham have friends? But let's just hold off on that for one sec. Just a couple of orders of business. One is that as a sad thing, which is that I'm going to try and end a little bit early today because I have to run to a funeral. Matt Silverstein, who often studies with us, his mother passed away, and the funeral's today, and so we wanted to dedicate today's learning to Ruth Silverstein's memory. May her soul have elevation from our learning, and wishing Matt comfort. He'll join us again in this space eventually, and hopefully our learning will be a comfort to him. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I on a happier note, I mentioned before, and I think I should still keep mentioning that I have this new Parsha podcast, and it's like 15 minutes of kind of like some investigation into the kind of core or one of the most important stories in the Parsha, and it's a good, I think, in some ways, teaser for this class. We're not going to do the same material on the podcast that we do in this class, but it's also good for anyone, either of you who wants to add 15 minutes or anyone who doesn't have time for an hour of Parsha. This is a good way to get some Parsha into your life. And the podcast is called Best Book Ever, and it's called Best Book Ever because it's about the Torah, which if I have any religious, I'm not much of a fundamentalist, but if I have any religious claim in the world, it's that the Torah is the best book ever. And so here's a link to this week's podcast so you can check it out. So take a listen, and of course, you know, the most important thing is to share it, not just for its viability, but also because the point of this is to widen the circle of I think we're all in a club together. We study the weekly Parsha together, and the bigger that club is, the more exciting our conversation is, because the more people we can talk about the weekly Parsha with, and that's part of what this is about, is being in the same conversation every week. Okay, I think that's good. So with that, let's say a blessing. We'll say a blessing over Torah study, and we'll get into our material today, which, as you'll see, is very, very different from anything I would dare to do on a podcast. So let's get started. We'll say a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thanking God for giving us this book that's so good to read together. Okay, here we go. Did Abraham have any friends? I mean, think about this question in a big way, whether friendship is a concept in the Torah at all. Now, if I was to think friendship in Judaism, I would most quickly go to David and Jonathan. Although their friendship is pretty complicated, so that already gets weird. But like, the nature of their relationship is they are friends. At least that's the named nature of their relationship. But think about it for a second. Did Moses have any friends? I mean, he has brother, and he had Joshua, but Joshua's a student. That's a more complicated relationship. Did Jacob have friends? He had a lot of people in his life, but who were his friends? I mean, it almost starts to sound like cute, like, oh, Jacob's friend, Abraham's friend. Do they have friends? Isaac, I would say, most distinctly did not have friends. They had their partners, thank God. I mean, they were in these relationships that were defining. That was their world. They had their families and their tribes and okay, but did they have friends? Okay. So that's just an interesting question to think about, and we're gonna take a look at Abraham's maybe friends today. But part of what we're in saying, like, if I asked you, who are Abraham's friends? Does anyone have an answer? Like, who knows who are Abraham's friends? That's an odd phrase. It's not like Abraham had obvious friends. You would think, who'd Abraham hang out with? Well, Sarah, maybe Lot, but that's his nephew. That's not his friend, and they weren't friends, right? So that doesn't. He has a servant later, but that's very, very different. Okay. So that's one, that's the big question hovering over our learning. But what we're also going to do today is some kind of nitty gritty work that I really love doing. And I said, in a podcast, I wouldn't dare do something like this. And part of what's nice about having a podcast where I'm going to talk about like the big issue, like, you know, you can bet that for next week, I'm going to talk about the binding of Isaac on the podcast, because I want people to know what is going on in this week's Torah portion. What's the big picture? But in this class where we have a little more space to kind of explore and go crazy, I want to today do with you and illustrate for you one of the kinds of investigation in the Torah that I love the most, which is to notice a named character, like that appears only in one verse or two, briefly mentioned. And then the Torah just sort of moves past. And it's just curious, because it's always a curious feeling, because you're like, this is our holy work. Every word of this book is treated as sacred. So why did you mention Devorah, Rebecca's nursemaid? Why is she in there? And Devorah turns out to be a prophet later in our story. So the name is found at, like, what do you do with that character? Do you just leave it by, well, that was interesting. Bye, Devorah. You know, and there are a lot of these characters who get named very, very briefly. And there are especially a lot of them in Genesis. The early Parshot of Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis, it's almost like too much, because a lot of it's genealogy. But I'm not talking about genealogy today. I'm just talking about the telling of the history of the ancient world. Right, the biblical history of the ancient world. The Bible tries to give us a sense of like what it was like back then in the ancient world, and mentions kingdoms and movements of people and leaders of military strength. And then we get these three guys who I think it would be fair to call Abraham's friends. Okay, so what are we going to do I said it's just a quick mention. What do we do when we find a character that just gets a quick mention like this? So the first thing that we want to do as students of this tradition, as students of the Torah, is to go to the Midrash. This is one of the great tools that the Midrash offers us, because Midrash, which is really the first kind of form of Jewish interpretation of the, that's not entirely true. That's not entirely true. I mean, we could talk about like earlier forms of interpretation, and but what we think of as rabbinic tradition begins with the people who were writing Midrash as well as Talmud. So it's like it's a major genre in our tradition. But one of the things that the Midrash is really, really interested in is filling in the gaps that the Torah, like if the Torah is written in this terse kind of skeletal way, the Midrash is really interested in giving us the backstory. And the most famous backstory that the Midrash ever gives us, the most famous Midrash of all, when I tell it to you, many of you are going to say, "Oh, I thought that was in the Torah." The most famous Midrash of all, and if I said, someone raise your hand and tell me, but I won't make you go through in a Zoom class. That's less exciting. But someone I'm sure out there is thinking it's the Midrash of Abraham smashing the idols. That's this week's Torah portion, Lech Lecha, because this week's Torah portion starts, Abraham, go forth, and Abraham was 75 years old. Whoa. Who is this guy? Who's Abraham? What world does he come from? What made him the special one? So the Midrash steps in and tries to tell the story. And the story they tell is that Abraham was a spiritual prodigy, that he was in his father was an idol manufacturer, and he was minding his father's shop. and then famously like smashed all the idols, the original iconoclast. And then when his father came back, he blamed it on one of the idols. They did it. And the father says, Terach says, they can't move. They're just rocks. And Abraham goes, right? So that's like the backstory that like, did that happen? I hate that question in general, but like, that's not the point. The rabbis are trying to imagine like what it is that would create Abraham. But with, even as I brush aside the question, did that really happen? Because it's clear the Midrash includes some degree of imagination, because we'll get various versions of the same back history. Maybe it was like this, or maybe it was like this. So I don't think they're even meaning us to take it literally. But I will tell you this, and this is part of what I want us to see today. Midrash is no joke. It's not just funny stories that the rabbis came up with. It's playful, but it's no joke in the sense that it's rigorous textual analysis. And they don't come up, I mean, as a rule, there might be bad midrashim out there, but as a rule, they don't come up with stories pulled out of a hat. Okay, they don't just make stuff up. There's always some textual grounding for the stories in the Midrash, and we're going to see an illustration of that today. And you know, this is obviously not the most important Midrash. The most important Midrash would be the Abraham backstory, right? But this is a great example of how a Midrash can be built even, and maybe especially, out of these characters that just sort of appear and then disappear. Okay, let's now take a look today at the characters that we might call Abraham's friends, and see what the Midrash does with them. So here is a source sheet for you today. And the first text that we're going to look at, we're not going to analyze. I need you to see the appearance of the place Elonei Mamre. Elonei Mamre. That's going to be an important place that we're going to be thinking about the whole time. And it's one of the first places that Abraham, when he gets that call, he goes down to Egypt, he wanders around, he does a lot of circling, and then finally seems to settle for a while at a place called Elonei Mamre. So let's just take a look at that place first. And let's see, here we are. Okay. Did Abraham have friends? We will try to figure that out today. Okay, and by the way, can I ask a question? I usually have the English on the other side, but I'm just sort of experimenting with usability here. I like using the editor view because it's just easier to edit in real time, and it's like more clearly laid out than the view that I think you get, which is more like this, right? Or you could arrange it more like, it's just harder to manipulate. So this is just, this is how you may be looking at it on your screen. But here in this view, I'm curious whether folks prefer the English on the right or on the left. Let me just show it to you once before we get started here, because side-by-side layout, Hebrew left, Hebrew right. Well, and then this is not, there. So that's the other view. And let's not have a whole conversation about it right now, but if you have a preference and you want to put that in the chat, that could be really valuable to me. I almost always do it this way, and I think it's just because my eye edits easier when the English is coming from this side of the page in the Hebrew. But you could say that it's easier to read the other way. So I am curious. So I'll take an informal poll there. But we're going to do it this way today. Okay. The Eternal said to Avram, and remember in the beginning his name is not yet Abraham. The Eternal said to Avram after Lot had parted from him, and I'm just doing like a running start here because this allows me to give you a feeling for who Abraham was hanging out with. He leaves the place that he leaves Haran with Sarah, his wife, and then Lot and Lot's family. Okay, but Lot and Abraham quickly get into conflict. So they're not friends, but they are family, and that will become relevant. Okay, so Lot, that's important. Lot is his nephew, and that will become relevant. Okay, so after Lot departed from him, God says, raise your eyes and look out from where you are to the north, to the south, and to the east. This is the Sfona v'negba v'kedma v'yama. You know that song, Yama v'kedma tzefona v'negba. That's where that language first comes from in the Torah. For I will give all the land that you see to you and your offspring forever. I will make the offspring as the dust of the earth, so that one can count up the dust of the earth. So that if you could count the dust of the earth, then your offspring can be counted. That's an interesting line. We won't pay attention to it today. Up, walk about the land through its length and its breadth, for I give it to you. Okay, that's kind of what's going on. And Avram moved his tent, or he set up his tent, V'yehal Avram, and he came to dwell at Elonei Mamre. And he came to dwell at, I think later I used an A for this. So let's maybe use an A. I'll try to be consistent here. Elonei Mamre. Okay. Now, this, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it will become important for us. And this Elonei Mamre, in itself, it's a name, but it's hard to translate. And now we're going to see that soon. But especially because Elonei, alone, seems to be maybe a plural for alon, which is a kind of a tree, maybe like an oak tree, or usually this is translated as terebinth. Is that the right pronunciation? Terebinth, the terebinths of Mamre. Okay, so the actual translation in Sefaria is he came to dwell at the terebinths of Mamre, or the Mamre tree area. That doesn't quite make sense, like he's dwelling amongst the trees. But anyway, we'll soon get to that. The point is there's a place called Elonei Mamre, the trees of Mamre, or as we'll soon see, there are other possible translations. I'll give away one now, just so you can have a little more concrete language in your brain. One of them is the plains of Mamre. He came to dwell in the plains of Mamre. Okay, well, that would make sense. Okay, so just so you have something that makes sense in your head, at the plains of Mamre, which is in Hebron. And Hebron, that's, I mean, it's a disputed, like conflict territory these days, but is very clearly a biblical city that is part of the kingdom eventually of Judea, the tribe. It's in the tribal allotment to Judah, and it's a big city in Abraham's life, or it's a big place marker in Abraham's life. Okay, and Abraham built an altar there to the Eternal. Okay, but just Abraham is going to keep circling back to this place, Hebron, like his, he'll bury his wife in this region. Okay, this is an important area, but for our purposes, Elonei Mamre. Okay, now I'm giving you some background here. I haven't let anyone talk yet, and it's been 20 minutes. But this is very detailed, and we need a lot of detail, and I'm soon going to open it up. But I'm going to now take us to the verse that we're going to analyze today. Okay, in Genesis, that was Genesis 13. End of Genesis 13 mentions Elonei Mamre, where Abraham settles. Now Abraham goes to war, but he doesn't mean to go to war. There's this talk about named characters that we don't get a lot of backstory on, but there's this huge fight between 4 kings and 5 kings. Right? There are 4 kings on one side and 5 on the other, and notably on one side are the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is where Lot settled when he left Abraham. But okay, there's a fight, and that's important that Lot settled in one of them, because at a certain point in the war, the invaders seized all the wealth of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went on their way, and they also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, and his possession. So Lot and Abraham didn't get along, but his nephew has now been taken captive, and so he goes to war on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah in order to recapture Lot. Okay, that's the background we needed. Now the verse that we're going to look at. A fugitive, an escapee, a fugitive, brought the news to Avram the Hebrew. He's named as Avram the Hebrew here, right, for the first time. Brought the news to Avram ha'Ivri, v'hu shochen ba'Elonei Mamre, who was dwelling at Elonei Mamre ha'Emori. Mamre the Amorite. Mamre the Amorite. So now it sounds like the trees of Mamre the Amorite, or the plains of Mamre the Amorite. Emor eventually becomes an enemy nation, but at this point, it's just another tribe. And Mamre has 2 brothers, or kinsmen, sometimes translated as kinsmen. It's not clear what the word brothers exactly means in these days, but it can mean something bigger than just literal brothers. But let's just call them what the Torah calls them, brothers. So there's Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshkol, and brother of Aner. And I know I've been talking a long time, but it's all to lead you to this verse. Vehem ba'alei brit Avram. For they were Avram's allies. Now, allies is the translation that we got here from Safari, and it's not bad, but it definitely misses a lot. It's not bad, and it's used here because there's a war. There's a war, and at the end of the war, significantly, Abraham, in his classic fashion, says, "Don't give me any reward. For me, nothing but what my servants have used up. But as for the share of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshkol, and Mamre," so he names them again, "let them take their share." Okay, that's the other detail. Right? Abraham's still thinking about these three guys after the war, but most important is that they are named as Abraham's Baalei Brit. Now, that's a phrase that's going to require some unpacking. Baalei Brit might translate as the partners in a covenant with Abraham. Here, let's translate that. Hold on. So, partners in covenant with, and it's just Avram at this point. So is it that they have a covenant together? They have a brit. The word for covenant is brit. Do they have a brit together? Or notice here that there's a little dash between brit and Avram, and that's because by tradition we read this as a Brit Avram is a joined phrase. So the covenant of Abraham, they're partners in the covenant of Abraham, which almost sounds like they are part of the religion, except that Abraham's covenant hasn't actually been fully developed yet. We're going to get to that at the end of this week's Parsha. Okay. Now, I really do apologize. Maybe I got carried away this week with all the details, but that's part of what we need is the details. But I guess now I just want to go back to my original question. Who are these people? Are these Abraham's friends? Did he make friends? Or what is partners in a covenant? And who are these three guys that he seems to be caring about? So any just first reads of the phrase Baalei Brit Avram, partners in covenant with Abraham. Richard, nice to see you, Richard. You need to unmute yourself though. I'm seeing Mark write in the chat, military allies. And yeah, that would be one way to read it. And if it is that, then it's certainly not it doesn't fall into the category of friends. These are people that Abraham banded with to go fight the war. And therefore, Abraham leaves them behind at the end of the war and says, you take your share, I'm off to my mission. That would be a colder, respectful, but colder relationship. Richard, what do you think?
Later on in the next couple of verses, it mentions that when Abraham goes off basically to war, he has 318 followers. And I always assumed that those followers were people that he tutored in Judaism. And I thought that might have applied to these also because they were members of the Brit Avram.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Richard. Brilliant. And that's something I should have kept reading. It's important. The next verse, as Richard points out, is equally important to get a feeling for our question. Our question really isn't the cute question, does Abraham have any friends? Our question really is, what is his world? Who is he surrounding himself? He's just out there in the desert alone with Sarah, or what's going? And right. Richard's exactly right to say, look, when Avram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he mustered his retainers. Again, I'm not sure about that translation. Actually, the word in Hebrew is chanichav, which is this related to the word for chinuch, education. So the people that he had trained, that's why it's not retainers, again, puts it in the military context. And it is a military context here, so that's fair. But there's something potentially, Richard says, more going on here. His retainers who were born into his household. So he's got a whole band of people here, and there are 318 of them. So actually, now suddenly it looks like Abraham is starting a movement. Abraham I mean, didn't that make sense, doesn't it? I mean, the guy founded our religion. Like, surely he's, I don't know, proselytizing or just gathering people around him. And ever you imagine these religious figures wandering, Abraham, Buddha, Jesus, whatever, they start to have people follow behind them, right? That's kind of the idea. So maybe that's who these people are. I want to jump to Alexandra.
I have a question and hopefully a comment afterwards, but maybe not. Does Chani, Chav, or whatever that word was, does it also share the same root as Chanoch and Chanukah for like rededication?
Yes. Yes.
So my thought was that it's possibly, and it's sort of the same thing you just said, but that they're allies in purpose and they're allies in a sense of dedication to God, or maybe they don't yet have an understanding of God, but to dedication to godliness.
Right. Right. Does, if I just like continue your thought, like, does the word brit, covenant in the Torah, yes, of course, it has a very kind of technical meaning. They are partners. But doesn't it have a kind of like higher feeling? The brit is going to be when we stand at Sinai, that's a brit. I spoke this year about covenant, my Rosh Hashanah sermon. I should post that, right? Somebody post that in the chat. But to promote me. No, but brit, covenant is a big word in our tradition. Right? So isn't it reasonable to assume that when you use the phrase Brit Avram, the covenant of Abraham, these are like people who are like, they're like-minded. In other words, now let's take note, because you have 3 people named in the Torah who seem to be doing the same thing that Abraham is doing. And Abraham, remember, we had to come up with a story. How is it that there was an Abraham in the world when everybody is an idol-worshiping pagan? No. Here's 3 other people who are living the same life. That's significant. That's important. That's worth thinking about. Okay, let's take another couple passes at this. Robert Niederman.
Yeah, I was thinking about something tangential. I do remember they had 318 followers or people he had a bris with or something. But then I'm thinking about, only 70 people went down to Egypt, which means that these people, and those were members of the family of Jacob, which means that these 318 people who were multiplying at the time were left behind in Israel. And it makes me wonder, well, what happened to them? Maybe when the children of Israel came back, these guys have already been multiplied and they joined up or something. I don't know.
Yeah. That's great textual work you're doing for us. First of all, I think there's a way to account for it because it's clear. Yeah, no, actually, I'm not even going to go down that route. I was like trying to start to add up the numbers, not even worth, but I will say this, speaking of adding up numbers, there's a very cool suggestion, again from the Midrash, that that the 318, exactly what Robert's saying, it's like, doesn't make sense that he had that many people around, because it ends up talking about how nobody seems to be. He seems to be very kind of like lonely, and when people encounter him, it seems to be just him and Sarah in the tent. It doesn't feel like a huge scene. And so later we find that he has a servant, and that servant's name seems to be Eliezer. And the rabbis figure out that Eliezer, if you add up the letters in Hebrew gematria, you get to 318. So who did Abraham send? 318. He sent Eliezer, who was as powerful as 318 men. So that's just like, that's a very wild midrash, although even so grounded in the text. But yeah, I think you're right. Richard sent us down a good path here to wonder, what is this whole scene that Abraham is in? But again, I want us to focus particularly on 3 named characters, one of whom, remember, has a name that is associated with the place that Abraham has settled, right? Like, this is not just one of the 3, but it's like, this is like Mamreville, where Mamre and his 2 brothers live, and Abraham settled there. Okay, one more thought before we move into the Midrash. Mark, you offered something in the chat, but do you want to add to your interpretation here?
Let me get off mute. I think it's really important not to be too anachronistic in looking at this text. The ancient Near East and its culture is very deeply reflected in the Torah text in general, and especially in Genesis. From every story, the flood story, the Tower of Babel story, and so on. Avram in these early sections seems to be primarily a tribal leader who was a judge inside his clan. He had a livestock business. He was a trader. And what he had to do in order to survive was to link up with other people for trade reasons and for safety reasons. So I think that that's part of what we're reflecting. It's great to look back and say the word Brit represents the spiritual journey of Avram. But I'm not so sure that that eliminates the ancient Near Eastern context in which this character arose.
Okay, that's totally fair. Thank you for that, Mark. Because we might say, and we might say this in various ways. We might say that it's an overread to suggest that these were Abraham's pals or beloved friends. That's an overread. Mark, we still hear you. It's an overread, and it might not just be an overread because we're ignoring the context of the story. Remember, this chapter is about a war. So and Mark wants to go in that direction. Mark wants to say these are, and the translators do too, right? That's a very good, solid read. This is about a military alliances, and fine. That actually also is an interesting question. Who was on Abraham's side? Who was Abraham against? How were those alliances formed? That's what covenant represents here. Okay, that's possible. I think it's also possible to wonder whether the concept of my friend is a human concept that everybody always has in some way, or whether, the particular kind of relationship that we refer to as friendship, or for that matter, the kind of love that we celebrate between intimate partners, if those kinds of relationships are culturally constructed and are different over time, there are different notions of relationship, different notions of individual life, different notions of love that shift over time. And so to say, oh, look, Abraham's being friendly to these people, they are his friends, is anachronistic. That may be so. Right, as I said, on the other hand, it may be that everybody always had friends. And so if Abraham is taking care of these people, one wonders what the backstory is, even if they were military allies. But if we're, part of what I want to say also in response to Mark's very helpful comments is, if we're being anachronistic, just know that our rabbis writing in the 2nd century were also being anachronistic, because by that point already, they imagined that Abraham had friends. And I'm going to take you now to the Midrash on this verse, and the Midrash gives us a story, and that's what we'll spend the rest of our time trying to unpack, the story of Abraham and his friends. And the Midrash uses, maybe not the word friends because it's not in English, but I think you'll see close enough. So I want to take us to the Midrash. I see one hand up that I don't necessarily want to lose. So Ari, do you have a quick thought that you could offer at this point?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me, just on this friendship thing, the two interesting things when I look at the text going on, which is, one is they're introduced right after he had this sort of strife with Lot, right? And they're introduced after this period of kind of, as you said, wandering. He goes to the land, he builds, he's in Haran, he builds some altar here, he builds some altar there, he goes down to Pharaoh and all this. And he comes to this place, and what struck me most, if I'm reading it right, is he builds an altar to the God, altar to God in this tents of mammary place. So it's not just, if I'm understanding this right, or at least potentially, it's not just he's friended there. He's on this other guy's land, building an altar to God. That's like, and Abraham seems to have very clear questions of ownership of land, right? You know, he builds an altar here. He wants the cave for the patriarchs there, but yet he's building an altar on someone else's land. To me, signifies something really, not just a military alliance, but something deeply spiritual alliance or shared. And we talk about the covenant. It's part of the covenant of Abraham. The covenant fundamentally is about the land.
Yeah.
So they are sharing this land.
I love that. I'm so glad we grabbed that comment, because that is such a great noticing there. Such a great, and part of what I love about it was what Ari's just done is exactly what the writers of the Midrash do. Let's look for clues. What do we see here? Ari's comments echo Alexandra's comments earlier that there's some kind of spiritual alliance, but Ari gives us a kind of a context for thinking about, my goodness, they were allowing Abraham to build an altar to God here on their land. First of all, that's just a usage question. But secondly, there was you're allowed to practice your religion, your beliefs in full, your connection to God in full force, full fury, full flame. Right? There's a real alliance here, a spiritual, maybe all of the things we're saying are true. Military alliance, spiritual alliance. And now the question is, were they friends? Did they actually talk to one another? Were they like, what do you think was happening? Now that we don't know from the Bible itself, but the Midrash is gonna try and fill in the backstory. So let's take a look here. This is a cool little Midrash. Okay. He was dwelling at Alone Mamre, Abraham. So this is, I said, this is the same people who write the Talmud, same figures. And so notice how it starts almost like a Talmudic debate. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah had a debate. Rabbi Yehuda said this means the plains of Mamre. That's where Mishraya Mamre, the flattened out areas of Mamre. And Rabbi Nehemiah said, no, this means the palace of Mamre. Elone Mamre was the name of Mamre's palace. People name their palaces, the oak tree of Mamre, like they name their casinos, or whatever. So, okay, there's a debate. Is it the palace of Mamre or is it the plains of Mamre? And they're also pointing out that according to Rabbi Yehuda, Mamre was the name of the place, the plains of Mamre. Fundamentally, it was a place name. But according to Rabbi Nehemiah, Mamre was the name of a man. Right? If it's the palace of Mamre, then all along we've been talking about Abraham going to dwell, to reside with a guy named Mamre. And this is, right, just to begin, making strong the claim that they're doing real textual work. Remember, Mamre is the name of a man because he has two brothers named. And he's called an Amorite. So on the one hand, it's the plains of Mamre. On the other hand, it seems to be a real person. And we didn't know that was the right translation, plains anyway. So maybe it's just the name of his palace. And Mamre was a guy, okay? Now things get creative, but we're gonna see still some insistence on textual linguistic connections. Why was he called Mamre though? Why was he called Mamre? Well, why that name? And this is part of the Midrashic interpretive assumption, is that the names have meaning. They're called that. The Torah refers to someone in some way because the Torah wants us to understand the deeper meaning of that name. All names have meaning in the Torah. Abraham's is Av Hamon Goyim. He'll be the father, right? Okay, why was he called Mamre? Rabbi Azariah said that Rabbi Yehuda said that Rabbi Simon said, so long list there of citing this, saying, why was he called Mamre? Because he spoke boldly to Abraham. Now that's funny. That's a funny thing. He got his name for speaking Shehimra Panim. He kind of like threw it in his face. He threw it in his face. Now this is like, the Midrash is like, where's the Midrash going here? Mamre was a guy, maybe who had a palace, and Abraham lived in the palace. Why'd they call him Mamre? Because he was a real Mamreer. And what that means is that he spoke right up in Abraham's face. But that doesn't sound like a friend. But take a look at what they mean to suggest by that. So now we get the core of the story. For when the Holy Blessed One told Abraham to circumcise himself, he went to get advice from his 3 friends. And here the word, I think, is friends. And you know what? It's even, if it isn't friends, it's even stronger than friends, because the word is ohavav, his beloveds, people he loved. Okay? Abraham went to, and not just that he loved them, but he went to get advice from them. He went to get counsel from them. Okay? This is like, just as we looked at that one verse and thought a lot about it in the Torah text, the partners in the covenant of Abram, I want us to think about this phrase here in the Midrashic text. When God told Abraham to circumcise himself, he went to get advice from his 3 friends. It's a fascinating thing for the Midrash to even suggest that Abraham, why does he need to get advice? Like he's not entirely sure what he wants to do. What if his friends say no, don't do it? Will he not get circumcised? So this is like already suggesting so much more in the realm of beloved relation, using the language of his loved ones. Okay? All right, let's just see though what his friends say, because this is really the punchline here. So his 3 friends, and we'll spend the rest of our time just thinking about these 3 positions. Aner, that's one of the brothers. Aner said to him, Kfar ben 100 shana ata, v'ata holech u'mitzayer et atzmecha? You're already 100 years old, and now you're going to go and injure yourself? What? God wants you, an old man, to cut into his flesh? Okay, that's all. That's it. And it's literally in the Midrash, it's like sarcastic like this. It's not like you shouldn't do that. It's, what, are you really going to do that? It's very Jewish. We see where that tone comes. No, you're gonna cut yourself. Okay, so that's Aner. Eshkol said, Ma tolechu misayem et atzmecha ben sonecha. This is a little harder to translate. Literally, it's what are you going to go and finish yourself amongst your enemies, or those who hate you. So, in other words, Eshkol said to him, this is going to make you a target. This is going to make you vulnerable, or I think even make you identifiable to your enemies, all those who hate you. So we've been thinking this whole time about Abraham's friends, but if he has ohavav, people he loves or people who love him, he also has sonav, people that hate him. And that's part of what the Midrash, as we've been doing, is playing with and doing. Abraham must have had people in his world that he was allied with and people that he was against, and maybe his spiritual vision played into that. Anyway, those are the first 2 positions. And then, most interesting, Mamre said to him, your God rescued you when you were thrown into the fiery furnace. Amr Lamare, Elokecha she'amad lecha b'kivshan ha'esh, defended you against kings, u'v'malchut, and saved you from famine, u'v'revon, and now asks you to do this thing, v'adavar hazeh she'amar lecha lim'ol, to circumcise yourself, ein ata shomea lo? And you're not going to do it? Again, this is Mamre and Eshkol and Aner clearly live, they have like a sarcastic family, like, that's the tone in their family. So just like Aner said, what are you're 100 years old, you're going to circumcise yourself? What are you, crazy? So Mamre says, God is literally hovering around protecting you, and he asks you to do this one thing, and you're not going to do it? What are you, crazy? This is sort of both the same tone. Okay, but that's Mamre. That's Mamre. Now, why make Mamre into Okay, well, let's finish the story. That's Mamre. And then Mamre, God says, the Holy One says to him, because you advised him to circumcise, I will not reveal myself to him in Aner's palace, or in Eshkol's palace, but in your palace. And here in some ways is like the final punchline, because it is later written in Genesis, and the Eternal appeared to him at Elone Mamre, where he was sitting at the opening of his tent in the heat of the day. And that's true. We get one more mention of Elone Mamre. It's the place Abraham, remember, he put his tent down. He's still there when the three angels come to visit him. Three angels who announced that he's going to have a child at an older age, that announced that they are going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, right? That all happens again at Elone Mamre. And I said, the Midrash wants to make textual links. One of them is just obvious is, well, God appears to Avram in this very big and bold way at Elone Mamre. That was a reward to Mamre. It was a reward to Mamre because Mamre told Abraham to follow God's command, whereas the other brothers were more like, nah, that's crazy. Okay. All right. Now we're running out of time here, and that's okay. We've set up like the good story, but we haven't gotten to any of the really juicy questions. And some of those questions, I want to just like throw them all out, and then for the next 5 minutes or so, try to see how we respond to them. But some of the questions I would ask are, what are Aner and Eshkol saying? These other positions, like, don't hurt yourself for God. Don't cut into your body. Don't mark yourself off to make you vulnerable to your enemies, to make you a target. Like, this is foolishness. And why do the rabbis even consider those positions? Why are those important, viable arguments that Abraham went and listened to and considered? So I want us to think about that. And then what is it that Mamre is saying? Mamre is saying, like, you've clearly got something, that you've got some kind of connection to God. You got to go all the way. That's the voice that like the Midrash wants to celebrate, that the rabbis want to celebrate, that God in the Midrash wants to celebrate. But what is that? That voice is up against those other two voices. Okay. The last thing though is, well, actually, you know what? I'm gonna ask that question, and then I'll ask a final question before we close. Let's take some thoughts on just sort of what is this conversation? Why is it here? And why do we have the two anti-circumcision positions, right? It's like we're again talking about whether in our culture, whether circumcision we should or shouldn't, right? It's like, that people argue these things. But Abraham was arguing them with his chevre, with his beloveds, with his friends. Okay, so let's think a little bit about that. Ariella.
Well, to me, what it's showing is Abraham sought counsel with the people that he respected, and he kept an open mind to all of the sides. He didn't say to any one of them, you're Meshuggah, you're crazy. And then at the end, he followed what he thought was best. But to me, it shows a leader takes counsel from the people that he trusts, looks at all sides, and then makes an action.
Yeah, that's great. That's exactly right. I mean, we're getting a new kind of characterization, depiction of Abraham as someone who, and Ariella says, who is a good leader precisely because we want our leaders to take counsel and to consider all opinions and not to always know the right answer, but to be reflective, to consider various. But what's so interesting about that in this case is that it means that Abraham, it's also a different Abraham because Abraham is sitting there thinking about these commands he's getting from God and wondering, as we might wonder, wait, this religion includes self-mortification? Like that we have an Abraham who's actually wondering, part of his wondering is, do I really follow this God? And that there are people around him who are like, no, this is crazy. And there are also perhaps people who are saying, no, you've got something here. You're tuned in to it is crazy, but look at everything else that's happened to you. Now, just imagine that Abraham at the binding of Isaac. Like God says, go kill your son. Imagine a story where Abraham goes and he talks to everybody he knows, which is the story we want, by the way. Well, God's asking a crazy thing. How can I possibly do this? There's no way, right? And his friends give him various opinions and maybe they talk him down from the ledge, right? That seems to be kind of what's going on here. Yeah. Okay, so that's a very different kind of imagining. The imagining of his friends also allows us to imagine an Abraham who, as Ariella is saying, has a different kind of temperament, isn't just like out there, the prophet, knowing everything, going wherever God tells, but someone who's a little more reflective, deliberative, taking counsel, and also someone who is in doubt. And this is, and here's like an important kind of like takeaway. This is the way that the rabbis express their own doubts about what's going on in the story. Because every reasonable person is going to look at circumcision and say, whoa, that's a little much. And every reasonable person is going to look at the binding of Isaac and say, that's a little much. The rabbis, in their discourse, they don't say, this is crazy. They eventually get to a place where they say, well, God wills this. But they have ways of saying, wow, that's pretty extreme. Okay, let's try to take two last comments. And so let's see if we can get to both Julia and Agnes.
So the thing that this is making me think about is Rashi's comment on Genesis 1:26 about Na'aseh Adam B'Tselmenu Kidmutenu, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. And it almost feels like Avram is mimicking God in this moment. At least according to Rashi, God is seeking out the counsel of the angels in making God. And although it's a little different because God's not necessarily taking in the opinion of the angels, but there's this sense that maybe in some way Avram is acting in the way that God acted in the creation of human. And perhaps for that reason, we should see Avram as all the more. Yeah,
that's a really, really nice connection. I'll just repeat it for those who don't know, but Julia says exactly right. There's another kind of midrashic imagining that when God created the first human, God took counsel with the other divine being. That's theologically very weird for us, but it's a nice idea that God is humble and God. That's the point of that midrash. The most powerful people should, we hope, be people, and this is not a person, this is a God, but that we're modeling this in this vision in our images of God, and our images of Abraham, and our images of Moses, etc. This is something the Torah isn't doing, back to Mark's point. This may not be the most precise read of the context of the Torah, but that the rabbis want to do. The rabbis are people who tell us, make for yourself a teacher, ukne lecha chaver, and acquire for yourself a friend. The rabbis had the idea of friendship. In fact, they more commonly called each other chaverim. That's where the term really starts being used. Okay, one last comment from Agnes.
This is maybe too, I'm not sure if this is like splitting hairs, but it feels like there's even something more than just getting advice in this moment. There's something about the activity of like getting into it with friends and talking about and reflecting on your own experience that somehow increases the holiness of Abraham's relationship. And I see that in there's like the shift from talking about Abraham Yoshev in this place and then Shochen in this place. And I feel like Shochen is like Mishkan, is like Shochen is like the divine presence dwells, Shochen Ad. And Abraham has gone from just like living here to like really dwelling here. And there's something in that, like, it's almost like doesn't matter who gives what advice. It's like the fact that he's gotten into it helps him inhabit it more comfortably or deeply or something. What a beautiful analysis of the language there. And that's such beautiful work, and also the work that Midrash would do. Noticing, as Agnes did, that's just so lovely, the way that Abraham first Vayeshev settles, and then then Abraham is Shochen. He dwell, like he really is. That's the language you use for neighbor. Abraham becomes like one there. He's one. He lives in the village. He's a neighbor. He's a mammary is his. That's his. I don't know, tribe, clan, village people. And let's end on the village people. No, but what I do want to end on, and then I have to close and run, is why are they talking about circumcision? Why are they talking about circumcision? And it would be fun to tease this out, but let me just tell you, okay?
They're talking about circumcision. This is also part of the brilliance of the Midrashic interpretive style. Well, because they were Balei Brit Avram. They were in council on the Brit of Avram, on Abraham's bris, on his circumcision. They were the people who weighed in on Brit Avram. So that's brilliant, but not just that, but take a look. This line that the Midrash ends on down here, and remember, the Eternal appeared to him in Elonei Mamre. That's Genesis chapter 18, verse 1. And look at what Rashi says there. The Eternal appeared to him to pay a visit to the sick, for it was the third day after his circumcision. Because in Genesis chapter 17, that's where we get the circumcision. In other words, the appearance at Elonei Mamre happens right after the command to circumcise. It happens at Elonei Mamre, at the whatever of Mamre, and Mamre was one of the people who was in council on the Brit of Abraham. So now the masters of Midrash see like, we've got a story. We've got a story. Print, send it to press, right? We've got a story. So that's how we got the backstory of Abraham's three friends. Okay, I think we have to end there. So I'll see you all next week. Have a good Shabbat tomorrow.